Everything reflects leadership or the lack thereof. In time, any organization is different, whether better or worse, as a result of leadership. Whether you're talking about a new coach, a manager, a teacher, a CEO, a parent, or a pastor, again, everything reflects leadership in time, and things get better or worse as a reflection of leadership. Leadership reflects the body of the organization in those situations when the organization selects the leader. The organization reflects the people when the people select the members of the organization. So therefore, the Speaker of the Republican House reflects House Republican majority membership. And the House Republican membership reflects the American voters. So the Speaker of the House, Speaker Mike Johnson, reflects the American voters. We may not like that, but it's true. The ultimate responsibility lies with us, the American people. We are still a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Our government still acquires and retains its power from the people, or as Thomas Jefferson wrote, from the consent of the governed, at least the people who choose to participate. Others give their implied consent by apathetic failure to participate. With respect to failure, Congress has been failing us for decades. That's reflected in the less than 20% approval rating for Congress, which is always interesting to me when you've got a 90% plus reelection rate for Congress when the approval rate is less than 20%. But the most important scorecard for Congress is and remains the debt, the $37 trillion in debt that's increasing by about $1 trillion every 4 or 5 months. And with nearly a $300 billion deficit in the month of July, the latest month for which we have final numbers, we're still going in the wrong fiscal direction. The deficit at $291 billion in July was about 20% higher than it was this time in 2024 when Democrats controlled the White House and the Senate. So it's getting worse under Republican leadership. I hope this is unacceptable to you. It certainly is unacceptable to me, as it was unacceptable to me when I arrived in Washington as a new member of Congress in January of 21. I came to Washington to be a disruptor, to confront the status quo, to fight for change. That's why I opposed former Speaker McCarthy becoming the Speaker in January of 23. My first 2 years in Washington, we had the minority in the House. Democrats had full control of government. And while I was encouraged by many of my constituents and asked by many of my constituents not to support Kevin McCarthy for Speaker if we were to obtain the majority, I said I would take my 2 years in the minority to assess him, his leadership or lack thereof, based on did he pursue conservative policies? Did he use every means at our disposal to resist the Democrats, even though we were in the minority? What did he do to fight the Democrat agenda? And I opposed him in January of 23 after we got the majority because I didn't believe that we could accomplish the change we needed with status quo leadership. You know, as has been said famously by many, when you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. And I didn't believe that Kevin McCarthy, as a product of the D.C. swamp, having been in Republican leadership for some 15 years or so, that he was an agent for the change that Republicans and more importantly, the country needed in Washington. So I opposed him becoming Speaker during those 15 rounds of votes in January of 23. I never voted for him to become Speaker. Ultimately, there were 6 of us who never voted for him, but he did become Speaker. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and tried to support him. And then I ultimately voted to remove him as Speaker after he continued the pattern of previous Republican leadership, where with Republicans in control of the majority in the House, all of the major spending legislation was being passed with Democrat votes because it did what Democrats wanted to do when we had the Republican majority. And even though in the previous 2 years, Republicans only controlled the House, and of course the Dems had the White House and had the Senate, Republicans could have shut down the entire Democrat agenda, could have defunded everything they wanted to simply with the House. The House is a simple majoritarian body where 218 votes, you can do whatever you want. And Speaker McCarthy, former Speaker McCarthy, was not willing to do that. He passed 2 major spending bills in his 9 months as Speaker, predominantly with Democrat votes, keeping in place the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer spending levels and policies from when they had full control of government. And so I was an active participant in removing him as Speaker in October of 2023. After that opening was created for Speaker, which was historical, unprecedented, it had never happened before in the House, where the American people saw their elected representatives in exercising a constitutional republic rise up and remove their leader of the House and have a contest, a competition to select a new speaker right in front of the American people on the House floor. Well, I can remember when I got that phone call from Mike Johnson. I was a leader at that time in the House Freedom Caucus. I was not chairman yet, but I got a phone call from Mike Johnson in October of 23, a few days after Kevin McCarthy was removed, when he called to tell me he was going to put his hat in the ring and run for Speaker. I had a frank and open conversation with him. That was a Sunday morning. And I talked with him about how I liked and respected him and how I believe we shared conservative values and principles. I had enjoyed serving with him in my, at that point, almost 3 years in Congress. But I hadn't seen him being tough or hadn't seen him fighting as a leader. He was a junior leader in the House, Republican House. And I was concerned about his toughness and his willingness to fight. And he gave me assurances on things he would do and how he would be. And I ultimately believed he was the best choice of the candidates at that time. And I supported him becoming Speaker. The Speaker should be the second most powerful person in government. Really should be a rival to the president in the sense that the Speaker is the leader of the Congress, certainly the leader of the House, more powerful than the Senate Majority Leader because the Speaker can command a one-vote majority to do whatever he or she wants in the House, where the Senate, of course, has to have 60 votes and has to have a supermajority. But Mike Johnson, I would submit to you, is neither respected or feared by almost anyone in Washington in the Republican House anyway. Mike Johnson owes his speakership, in fact, to President Trump. After the end of the last Congress, after the election, November of 24, that gave Republicans full control of government, Republicans had their organizational meetings in November, and I believe Mike Johnson's support was very weak to remain as Speaker until President Trump endorsed him. President Trump came to our Republican conference meeting to put his strong support behind Mike Johnson, I believe because he knew he could control Mike Johnson. He knew he could bully Mike Johnson. He knew Mike Johnson would be his legislative puppet in the House and do whatever President Trump wanted him to do, where what the American people need is a strong, courageous, principled Speaker who does what he believes is right and shows courage and principle and is a balance to the president, supports the president's agenda when he's right, which with President Trump is more often than not, but challenges the president and resists him when he doesn't believe that he's right or he's acting in a way that's not constitutional or within the appropriate limits of the executive branch. But Mike Johnson owes his speakership to President Trump. I don't believe he would have been voted in as Speaker again back in November if it weren't for President Trump's support. The Freedom Caucus had some concerns about him as Speaker, but they dropped that opposition back in November after President Trump's endorsement of Mike Johnson. But I submit that Mike Johnson would quickly be replaced as Speaker if he was not supported by President Trump, and he knows that. And sadly and unfortunately, I believe that Mike Johnson's primary mission is to remain Speaker. I've often said how the problem in Washington is that most members of Congress's top priority is to be in Congress, to stay in Congress, to get reelected. And if that's your top priority, then you're going to obviously operate in your own selfish interests and do what you think is in your best interest politically instead of doing what you believe is right or what needs to be done. And Mike Johnson epitomizes that, where his primary desire or mission is to remain as Speaker. And that, again, is the classic epitome of what's wrong with Washington. I would also submit that Mike Johnson's lack of principle and integrity in the way he's conducted himself as Speaker in the past now almost 2 years is even more offensive because of his stated beliefs and values, as he has always professed to be a strong conservative. He professes to be a born-again Christian, a strong believer. But I don't think that his stated beliefs always translate into the policies or the actions that are consistent with those beliefs. Did the speakership change Mike Johnson, or did it simply reveal who he is? That is a deeper discussion, a deeper debate that's outside the scope of this podcast. But I would submit that his focus has been on raising money for the party and preserving the status quo or the system and remaining speaker. He's worked to protect the moderates in the Republican House and to unnecessarily expose or place at risk conservatives. But I would ask you, what do Republicans actually have to show for now more than 2.5 years of control of the of the House? Republicans have had the majority for now more than 2.5 years. Has there been permanent action to secure the border or to implement America First immigration policy, to ensure election integrity or appropriate oversight of the executive branch to ensure what happened under the Biden administration isn't allowed to be repeated, to hold the swamp accountable for the truth of what happened on January 6th or what happened during the Biden administration, the truth about the Epstein files, the lawfare or weaponized federal law enforcement against conservatives, the weaponized FBI and Department of Injustice under Biden. So what's the long-term impact of House legislative action? What are the laws that have been passed with the House majority, certainly these since January, with full control of government under Speaker Johnson? Going back a little bit to after Speaker Johnson ascended to that position, October of 23, with the House majority, all major legislation over the next 14 months, so in what was the 118th Congress, all major spending legislation passed with more Democrat votes than Republican votes. So Republicans were in the majority over the last 14 months before this new year with full control of government. But when the Republicans had just the House, they continued the pattern under Speaker Johnson that was going on under Kevin McCarthy and previous leaderships, Paul Ryan, John Boehner before them, where when the Republicans had control and the majority in the House, they passed primary major legislation with Democrat votes instead of Republican votes. Under Speaker Johnson in the last Congress, Republicans failed to cut $1 of spending. They continued a $200 billion monthly deficit. They doled out thousands of earmarks for tens of billions of dollars to provide Republican members political cover for bad votes they were taking. With an average of 203 Democrat votes. Now, Democrats, again, were in the minority, but an average of 203 Democrat votes, Speaker Johnson passed 7 major spending bills, 5 continuing resolutions or CRs, and 2 minibuses that kept in place the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer policies and spending levels from when Democrats had full control of government. So rather than defunding the Democrat agenda, Speaker Johnson provided continued funding of that agenda, predominantly with Democrat votes in the last Congress. With 206 votes, the Democrats kicked out George Santos. With 206 Democrat votes, Speaker Johnson allowed the House to kick out George Santos, who had not been convicted of any crime, the former congressman from New York. He twice reauthorized FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, without a warrant requirement. We tried to amend FISA, that terrible bill that was passed, that legislation that was passed after 9/11, that allows the federal government to surveil or spy on U.S. citizens without a warrant. We tried to prevent that from being reauthorized without reforming it appropriately to protect our constitutional rights. And Speaker Johnson instead supported its reauthorization without a warrant amendment, which continues the illegal and unconstitutional surveillance of U.S. citizens to this day. He led the Republican House in borrowing tens of billions of dollars to send to Ukraine and Hamas, passed a tax bill giving tax credits to illegal aliens, failed to use any leverage to do anything to secure our borders. In November of 2024, with 196 Democrat votes, passed a bill that increased mandatory spending by $200 billion in what was called the so-called Social Security Fairness Act. And with Democrats voting 196 to nothing in favor in December of 2024, at the end of the last Congress, he added another $100 billion to the debt with so-called disaster relief funding. So to deal with some disasters from the flooding and so forth that came at the end of last year. Again, Democrats voted 196 to nothing to pass $100 billion in new spending when Republicans had control of the House. All of this contradicts what Speaker Johnson promised would happen under his leadership if he became Speaker. And so I'm going to get a little bit wonky in this podcast with some legislative minutia. I want to give you the receipts on what has happened since Speaker Johnson has been the Speaker of the House, going back to October of 23, a little bit more detail, and up until the current time where we find ourselves today. After Speaker Johnson ascended to speakership in October of 23, again, all major spending legislation passed with more Democrat votes than Republicans in the last Congress. Specifically, November of 2023, he passed a continuing resolution with 209 Democrat votes and only 127 Republican votes. It was passed under what's called suspension of the rules, which means no amendments, not the required amount of time to read the bill, waive the rules, pass it under suspension of the rules, and 93 Republicans opposed it. Only 2 Democrats opposed it. So Republicans voted 127 for it, 93 against. Democrats, 209 for it, only 2 against, to fund the government in November of 2023, right after he became Speaker. He operated the way previous Republican leaders have, Speaker McCarthy and others, that he refused to shut down the government or to defund the Democrat agenda. In December of 2023, December 1, is when he allowed the House to vote to kick out George Santos. 206 Democrats voted to do that, only 105 Republicans. As a matter of fact, 112 Republicans opposed it, and only 105 favored it. So the Republicans, it broke the rules of the majority that he had agreed to, where he wouldn't pass legislation that a majority of Republicans didn't support. However, Democrats supported it 206 to 2. And this reduced our Republican majority and gave the Santos seat to the Democrats. The Democrats won that seat in a special election after Santos was removed. December 14th of 2023, at the end of the year, at the end of the first year that Johnson was Speaker, we passed the National Defense Authorization Act with a FISA extension. Again, attaching to it the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, spying on U.S. citizens without a warrant. 163 Democrats voted for it, only 147 Republicans. Again, majority Democrat votes for that bill, passed again under suspension of the rules. In January of 2024, he passed another continuing resolution with 207 Democrat votes and only 107 Republican votes, again under suspension of the rules. January 31st of 2024, he passed a tax bill that gave tax credits to illegal aliens, and again got more Democrat votes, 188, than Republican votes, 169, once again passed under suspension of the rules. In February 29 of 2024, he passed another continuing resolution, again keeping in place the Biden-Pelosi-Schumer spending levels and policies to give the Democrats a few weeks to negotiate with Republicans on an omnibus for fiscal year 24, but it passed again with 207 Democrat votes and only 113 Republicans. So almost double Democrat to Republican support. March of 2024, he passed the first of 2 omnibus bills with 207 Democrat votes and only 132 Republican votes, again under suspension of the rules. Why would Democrats keep voting for Republican bills? Because they kept in place Democrat policies and Democrat spending levels. March of 2024, just 2 weeks later, March 22, passed the second omnibus with 185 Democrat votes and only 101 Republican votes. Again, this is when Republicans had the majority in the House, once again passed under suspension of the rules. In April 2024, he passed the reauthorization of FISA, again, the ability for the federal government to spy on U.S. citizens without meaningful reform to protect our constitutional freedoms. 147 Democrats voted for it, only 126 Republicans. In April 19 of 2024, he put together a package of borrowed money, unpaid support for Ukraine and for Israel together in one vote so that we couldn't separate them and vote just on Israel, just on Ukraine. He wanted to make sure that the Ukraine aid passed, so he packaged it with Israel, all of it borrowed, and you had 165 Democrats vote for it versus 151 Republicans. That put conservatives in a tough spot because some wanted to support Israel and didn't want to support Ukraine. Many of us didn't want to borrow the money to do it, wanted it to be paid for. In April 20 of 2024, he voted to send more money to Ukraine with 210 Democrat votes and only 101 Republican votes. Republicans actually had 112 against it and only 101 for it. So again, no Democrats opposed it. Democrats voted for it 210-0. Republicans voted against it 112-101. Again, this is in a Republican House when we had the majority. In September of 2024, he passed another continuing resolution funding the government with the Pelosi, Biden, Schumer spending levels and policies with 200 Democrat votes and no Democrats opposed, while Republicans only voted for it 132-82. So 82 Republicans opposed it. In November of 2024, he passed the Social Security Fairness Act, or so-called Social Security Fairness Act, again with 191 Democrat votes, that increased mandatory spending by over $200 billion over 10 years. So Social Security is already going bankrupt. It's not sustainable. It needs to be reformed. And he made it worse by passing this with 191 Democrat votes, majority Democrats, not majority Republicans, to add $200 billion of borrowed money for that to make it even worse. Then finally, at the end of last year, December 20 of 2024, passed the final CR of the year, but added, it wasn't just a continuing resolution that kept the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer spending levels and policies in place, but it added $110 billion in new supplemental spending for disaster, so-called disaster spending and more farm aid. And the Democrats supported it 196 to nothing. So it borrowed an additional $110 billion at the end of last year, giving the Democrats one more gift before they lost full control of government at the end of last year. Now we're in the 119th Congress with full control of government by Republicans. Republicans, of course, have the White House with President Trump. They have the Senate and they have the House. But Democrats are now no longer providing the majority of votes because they don't want to cooperate with President Trump and John Thune in the Senate. But the Democrat level spending, and again, the Biden, Schumer, Pelosi policies are still on the books because Speaker Johnson came and passed another CR, another continuing resolution back in March, and is expected to pass another one at the end of this month in September when the funding of the government ends on September 30. He broke his word last year and this year, where again, Republicans took the House took the August recess, the 5-week August recess, in spite not passing 12 individual spending bills, and instead facing another CR or an omnibus or a minibus, putting all the bills together. And now Republicans come back from recess, they're back in session, and they're not even pretending they're going to pass the 12 individual bills. They're conceding they're going to do a CR, another continuing resolution, and they're defending it as if it's good that they're just freezing spending with a CR, and they're not even talking about cutting spending when Republicans control all of government, the House, the Senate, and the White House. They own the fiscal impact. They own it going to next year's midterm elections when the deficit is going up, again, a record $291 billion in July without it being a COVID month. Republicans should instead be passing bold legislative priorities with the majority they have in the House and the Senate and the White House, and dare the Democrats to shut down the government. They can pass whatever they want in the House with a simple Republican majority. They have the majority of votes in the Senate. Chuck Schumer needs to provide some votes to keep the government from shutting down. But Republicans should not fear a government shutdown. It would be a Schumer shutdown. Instead, Republicans ought to be pursuing 12 individual spending bills that pass into law the great policies that President Trump is implementing through executive action as the president, but are not long-lasting into the next Democrat administration without congressional action codifying them. But he ought to be taking bold, courageous action, Speaker Johnson, and leading the Republican House to secure the border, to cut spending and shrink government. Again, it's only and always about the money in Washington. And it's not just waste, fraud, and abuse. You've got to cut popular spending, spending that isn't justified, spending for which we don't have the money, spending for which we can't just continue to borrow. He ought to pass legislation to enable recommendations from the DOJ department to automatically take effect unless Congress overrides them. We ought to return to pre-COVID spending, where we would have a surplus now if we just went back to 2019 spending. We need to reform mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We got to reduce the federal workforce, eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, the Departments of Education, Energy, Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Labor. Those departments should be eliminated. Ending corporate welfare, including subsidies for farm and agriculture and energy and climate. Restore work requirements for federal subsistence, for able-bodied working age Americans, end welfare for them that are, and stop subsidizing a culture of dependence and generational poverty. We need to cut Medicaid, housing assistance, food stamps, cash welfare, again, for the able-bodied working age individuals for whom these were never intended. End foreign aid that we're borrowing money to send overseas. No more unpaid supplementals where we borrow money for so-called emergencies instead of establishing an emergency fund by cutting our spending and shrinking government. For that matter, cancel all the outstanding emergency spending. There's trillions of dollars that's still out there for thousands of emergencies over the last decades that need to be canceled out. We need to claw back subsidies for the Inflation Increase Act or the IRA that were for climate and wind and solar and other subsidies related to that. Claw back unspent COVID funding and the expansion of the IRS. We've got to strengthen and refocus the military and look at our defense spending. When you're borrowing and spending about $900 billion on defense, we wouldn't have the biggest, baddest, meanest military on the planet, but we've got to codify into law ending climate considerations in the defense bill, LGBT funding, abortion funding, diversity, equity, inclusion policies, critical race theory in our academies and our militaries, attacking waste and inefficiency, figuring out why the Defense Department can't pass audits. We need to reduce the number of flag officers or the generals and the admirals, which has greatly grown over the last few decades in their proportionality to the enlisted ranks. We need to prohibit those who are in defense from lobbying or working in the defense industry for 10 years after retirement or even permanently, and prohibit those members of Congress who served on Armed Services Committee, Foreign Affairs, and Homeland from owning stocks in these industries for which they have jurisdiction. We need to end climate policies and restore and expand our energy dominance. We need to unleash nuclear and eliminate the criminality of the nuclear industry so that that can flourish as the cleanest, safest, most plentiful opportunity for affordable, reliable energy. We need to pass laws dismantling the deep state, reforming the FBI. We need to continue investigations and criminal referrals for those in the Biden Department of Justice or Injustice and the Biden's weaponized FBI for the things they did over the last 4 years. Repeal Obamacare, reform healthcare. We need bold, courageous, principled leadership from our speaker, from Speaker Johnson or whoever the next speaker could be if he were to be replaced as speaker. Courage and principle leadership is in short supply in Washington, especially in the speaker's chair, and it certainly has been under Speaker Johnson. But we, the people, again, still hold the power. Again, we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The government acquires and retains its power at the will of the American people. If we will use that power, and what we need to do is to let our elected representatives know that we expect them to cut spending and to shrink government now with the funding of the government that expires September 30. That when they pass new funding that goes into fiscal year 26, which begins on October 1, we expect Republicans to do what they said they would do when they're campaigning. They're asking for a vote, which is cut government, cut spending, shrink government. And we need to let Republicans know we will primary them with true conservatives if they don't vote to cut spending and shrink government. And of course, obviously, we need to replace Democrats every place that we can. This is our role in keeping the republic as American citizens who are engaged and participating in our constitutional republic, our representative democracy. So thanks for joining me for this episode of the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. Please remember to rate the show, to subscribe to the podcast, to share it with your friends. Follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Let's keep the republic.